Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Fantasy Sports Network. We are in the last segment of today's show, and it should be exciting. This is the first time I've done a segment of this kind before on the show, and I'm really looking forward to doing these over the next week and maybe in the future as well as we get closer to the fantasy football season and the NFL season as well. We are going to be doing a player profile. Now, what is a player profile? It is a deep dive into a player's fantasy stats over the years, potentially looking at their fantasy career, last year what they did well in, looking at certain traits and attributes that could help you decide whether or not they are the right choice for you at certain positions. We are going to start off in the QB position. It's a huge hint for who today's player of focus is. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. The player that we are going to be focusing on today is one of those guys who is going to be highly coveted at the QB position. So drum roll, please. The player in question is Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson, he has been one of those guys who, especially because of his dual threat ability, is a guy who has really become one of the most coveted fantasy QBs in the past couple of years. I really think that this can be the year where Lamar Jackson really elevates his status. He has the skill position players around him now. He has Zay Flowers, a young receiver who I really like. OBJ, well, he's gone now, but Mark Andrews coming back from injury. Always a reliable target for Lamar Jackson, and so I'm really excited to see how Lamar Jackson plays with one of the best receiving cores he's had in years, much like he had last year, where he truly got back to 2019 form and winning MVP as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into the fantasy player profile of Lamar Jackson. And throughout his career, he has had a fantastic points output. 1,713.3 points in his career as a fantasy athlete. His best ever season was 2019, his first MVP season, where he put up 415.68 points with 36 touchdowns to only 6 interceptions in that year. Last year was definitely a lot like that as well, as he took home MVP as well. Also, last year, let's just go over some of the statistical things where he excelled in. It was the first top 3 finish he ever had at the position in terms of fantasy since 2019. Amongst all quarterbacks last year, he ranked first in rushing yards per game, third in red zone carries, and fourth in rushing touchdowns. He was 10th in passer rating from a clean pocket, and he was 6th in adjusted completion. His average draft position going into this upcoming season is 32, so kind of a mid-round pick. His projections for next season, he is projected to throw for 3,513 yards, 26 touchdowns, and 11 picks. On the ground, projected to have 738 yards and 4 touchdowns. But here's a stat that is kind of worrying about Lamar heading into next season, especially considering the fact that in a QB market that's ever evolving, you want to find the next big thing. Last year, he had 6 weeks as one of the top 6 guys at the QB position in terms of fantasy, but he also had 6 where he was 16th or worse. So that is the volatility of a guy like Lamar Jackson. Now, the reason why I chose Lamar Jackson as the first player is because of that hit or miss ability. I didn't want to choose a guy who, like Josh Allen, who I'm actually going to preview tomorrow, where you know his stats are going to be good. You know he's going to always be at the upper echelon of fantasy QBs. I wanted a guy who proves he can be that, but also falters in certain areas. And so, looking at Lamar Jackson, the traits that stand out: he is a fantastic dual threat quarterback. No matter who is in the backfield, whether it's a running back by committee or now they bring in Derrick Henry, who they really think can make an impact even as he gets up there in age. Lamar Jackson will always have that ability to take off on the run, whether it be design, whether it be breakdown of a play, whether it be an RPO, what have you. Lamar Jackson will always have that ability. The big question surrounding him has always been, if you surround him with wide receiver talent on par with some of the better wide receiver cores in the NFL, what would he be able to do with it? And last year, he really kind of stepped up to the plate as a thrower, in my opinion. Obviously, it didn't all pan out. In the AFC Championship game, he looked very bad. And especially in the playoffs, Lamar Jackson has had a lot of questions surrounding him. But in terms of fantasy, when you look at the regular season, Lamar Jackson has been one of the more consistent fantasy QBs. Yes, that stat is kind of worrying and gives me pause, where he did have 6 finishes where he finished at the QB 16 or worse position. But everyone knows how Lamar Jackson just needs that level of consistency around him to really tone into what he does best. And no matter what, the Baltimore Ravens will always be a Lamar Jackson-centric team. They know what he's good at. They know that he can elevate certain players in the regular season at the very least. And he can also be a guy who gets a lot of yards. And so, the reason why Lamar Jackson is a player who you should be fascinated by in terms of fantasy and might want to pick up rests on that. If we just look at the regular season, Lamar Jackson is better than stellar. Now let's get into why I think that Lamar might not be a good fantasy QB in certain situations. And the answer might shock you. Mark Andrews. I think that Mark Andrews is Lamar's go-to receiver, and being a tight end, and not only being a tight end but also being that go-to guy, is really difficult. And as we can see, it has taken a toll on Mark Andrews over the past couple of years. He's been beset by injuries, mainly due to the fact he gets a lot of the target share for this offense. And so, the big question surrounding Lamar is he going to now be able to trust a guy in Zay Flowers who's still growing? As we saw last year, he made a little bit of a mistake in that AFC Championship game. So that's the huge question for me. Will Lamar Jackson, when he's throwing the football, when he's put in a situation to throw the football, will he be reading and processing the field in a way that's not always centered around Mark Andrews getting open? Or will he look to Zay Flowers more and really make the Baltimore Ravens more of a vertical threat, thus allowing him to put up the points you need for your fantasy football team? That's the only reason why Lamar Jackson right now to me is a player who I might fade. For all intents and purposes, in my humble opinion, if I had a pick to pick a quarterback, Lamar Jackson would definitely be on my list. He would be right up there with the Josh Allens, the Patrick Mahomes of the world, the Dak Prescotts, at least in terms of fantasy. But the one thing giving me pause is, can Lamar Jackson prove that he's a quarterback willing to elevate his game around the game of his wide receivers? Because you definitely have a better structure there for him. Zay Flowers could be a star in this league. Mark Andrews already is. Rashad Bateman is a fantastic wide receiver 3 option to have. But right now, I want Lamar Jackson to prove to me that in any given situation, whether or not you have all your wide receivers at your disposal or if you're down a man, can you prove to be someone who is not stuck in their own ways of, oh, this guy is already my superstar, I'm just going to give it to him and hope he produces? Because at some point in his career, Lamar Jackson is going to have an even better quarterback room, maybe in the near future. But right now, with what he has, He needs to prove that these are the guys that he wants to go into battle with. These are the guys he wants to throw the football to. And that's the key for Lamar Jackson to find that level of consistency that not only says, I should be in the top 5 fantasy QB discussion for next year, but for 5 or 10 years along the line. So, with Lamar Jackson, it could go either way. You could be getting a guy who is consistently in the QB5 discussion every single week, or a guy who, later on as the season wanes down, he could start losing that ability. So, that is why I decided to choose such a polarizing player as Lamar Jackson, my first player to kick off this style of segment. I hope you guys enjoyed it, but that should just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Chris Shepard. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show. Thank you yet again for tuning in. Please like, follow, and subscribe to the show. It's a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters and the network. Consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud, another way to support the network as well. Anything you leave is greatly appreciated. But thank you guys yet again for tuning in to today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We'll be back tomorrow with yet another exciting show.